Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome aboard. This is your captain speaking, Debbie Buyaki. Today, we'll be taking a flight over nature's view, kicking off from Nairobi, heading towards the UK, Ireland, the UK. We'll see. I hope you enjoy this exquisite flight. Seatbelts on and wheels up. My guest today is a climate activist originally from Dublin, Ireland, and has studied law at the University of Cambridge. She has been involved in organizing since 2019, beginning with climate strikes, and has worked nationally and internationally on climate justice, law, and education. She was involved in the case which overturned Ireland's climate legislation and coordinated a 2-year process for special thematic reports to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child to draw a link between children's rights and the climate crisis. Her university dissertation was on ecocide, which you should listen to that episode if you haven't. She's an Arctic angel and is working with Global Choices to research international law and rights, a proposed moratorium on industrial activity in the Arctic. Very impressive. As is the norm, please introduce yourself, where you're from, and what you're currently into.
I'm Beth. I am 20. I'm from Dublin, but living in Cambridge in the UK. And I am currently I've gotten really back into reading fiction as a break from my degree. So,
What degree are you taking?
oh, my degree. I'm currently doing law, so I'm in my final year of law at the minute.
The geniuses are here, so I'll start with the questions and the gist of the episode. There are different forms of water, and ice is one of them. Maybe we can lean into what season 3 will be about. So tell us about the Arctic, the amount of ice there, and its importance.
Yeah, so the Arctic is a region that I think can often be left out of a lot of discussions and is something people don't necessarily think of, especially if they don't live, I guess, in the Arctic Circle. But it's something that really does affect all of us, and it's almost the air conditioning of the world. So the Arctic ice, the Arctic is an ocean with frozen ice, and it is absolutely essential to our global system, to cooling air, to basically keeping things working up there. But it's currently warming 2 to 3 times faster than the rest of the world, and it's looking like we might have ice-free summers by 2030. So summers where there is no ice in the Arctic, which will have devastating consequences for the people and wildlife that live in the Arctic Circle and in the Central Arctic Ocean, but also devastating consequences for our global tipping points and for our ability to limit global warming below 1.5 degrees. So it's really crucial that we save the Arctic because, once it's gone, it's gone. And as Global Choices, the organization I work for, always says you can't plant ice, so we need to protect it while we have it.
Oh my gosh, that's really interesting that we actually have 2 air conditioning systems. I didn't think of the Earth as... Anyways, I think it should have made sense when you talked about not hitting 1.5 degrees. But yeah, that's quite interesting. So what is the linkage between this ice and climate change?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different things in terms of the Arctic's role. So I'm by no means a scientific expert, but essentially the Arctic helps to cool air and send cool air back down from the poles. Antarctica as well, which is in the south, which is a frozen continent, whereas the Arctic is a frozen ocean. They both play this very crucial role in cooling air and water and recirculating it through, where it then gets heated up again kind of at the equator and then goes around. So that's a very delicate ecosystem that we have that keeps our planet livable. And so if we lose the ice, firstly, the water gets warmer, this leads to sea level rise, and we also lose that cooling effect. Secondly, the ice is a really bright white color, and what this does is it creates what's called the albedo effect. So the albedo effect is sun radiation coming into Earth and is reflected back into the atmosphere, which helps again to limit the temperature of the ocean, it helps to limit warming, and it really adds that air conditioning effect of the Arctic. And so as the ice melts, we're losing that albedo effect, because the other issue with ice-free summers is if the ice melts and then comes back in the winter, it's not as thick, it's not as old as the ice is currently. And this is another issue with countries that are building what's called ship breakers. So these are massive ships that can cut through the ice. And once you cut the ice, it never heals the same way. And so you lose this effect that reflects the solar radiation back up into the atmosphere. And you also get warmer oceans, and that leads to warmer temperatures, and it basically leads into this toxic cycle.
Is it me or I have never heard of this? And I'm so shocked that we actually have people going there despite all these warnings.
Absolutely. Yeah, we have a lot of countries and companies that are, as the ice melts, they're basically trying to see how can they extract from it. And so we see a lot of nations trying to extract oil and gas from the Central Arctic Ocean and basically trying to make money off of the ice melting.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
And so my follow-up question would be, what does extinction of this ice mean to human beings, ecosystems, and even biodiversity?
Yeah, I mean, the loss of the ice would be catastrophic, and there's no other way to describe it. Ice free summers by 2030 will be devastating, and the complete loss of the ice will be a point of no return. There's a few million people that live in the Arctic Circle. So you have the Arctic Circle, which is that region of the Arctic Ocean and the nations that kind of surround it. You've got a few million people there, including a lot of indigenous communities who have been the custodians and the safeguardians of this ice for millennia, and their ways of life are threatened. Then you have unique biodiversity, flora and fauna that are also threatened in the Arctic. And it's not just what happens in the Arctic won't stay there. It will be devastating for our ability to limit global warming and also for our extreme heat, for weather catastrophes, and essentially for the acceleration of climate change.
I was reading some statistics that with every centimeter rise in sea level, 2.3 million people are affected. And Greenland is losing 30 million tons of ice per hour. And this is by satellite measurements. And this causes 7.5 meters of sea level rise. So you can imagine the billions of people this would affect if we continue acting like it's normal. But anyway, so tell us what's underneath the ice and why we're pushing for the 10-year moratorium on the halt of its operations.
Yeah, so in terms of what's underneath the ice, so there's two poles, and there's the Arctic and there's the Antarctic. So the Arctic is in the north and the Antarctic is in the south. The Antarctic is a frozen continent, so under the ice is land, and it's also regulated differently. So, and this is just to give context, I suppose the moratorium is also the Antarctica has what's called the Antarctic Treaty System. So in the 1950s, there was a couple of states who all claimed parts of Antarctica, and they all agreed to suspend their claims. So they didn't give them up, they didn't agree to anyone else's claims. And those countries were, amongst others, the UK, France, I think New Zealand, Australia, I'm not entirely sure. But they relinquished their claims. So that is meant to be frozen as a continent of peace and science. And so there's no permanent population of Antarctica, it is just scientists. The Arctic, on the other hand, firstly, is an ocean with ice on top of it. So it's a frozen ocean more than a continent with ice on top. And secondly, there's the Central Arctic Ocean, which is the area that is beyond any state's national jurisdiction. So essentially, it isn't recognized as belonging to any one country. But there's also several countries that are in the Arctic: Norway, Canada, the US through Alaska, Denmark through Greenland, Sweden, various states. And you have lots of people living and, working and, living within the Arctic Circle. And so it's a very different sphere in terms of how it's regulated. And so the moratorium that we're proposing is essentially saying the Central Arctic Ocean, so the area beyond national jurisdiction, the area that doesn't belong to any one country, as much as land can belong to any one country, should be protected. And so what we're seeing, as I mentioned earlier, as the ice melts, we're seeing the possibility of transpolar shipping routes, which would be ships going through and over the North Pole in the summer because the ice will no longer be there, which will have devastating impacts to the local biodiversity there. There's really unique biodiversity in the Central Arctic Ocean. It will pollute the water. There's noise pollution concerns. But also, if there is any ice still there, the icebreakers will continue to break that ice. There's also talks of oil and gas exploration, deep sea mining, and essentially states and companies wanting to get short-term profits at the expense of the long-term survival of the Arctic. So essentially the moratorium is calling for a 10-year pause. So essentially just no industrial activity in the Central Arctic Ocean, no oil and gas exploration, no transpolar shipping, no deep sea mining for 10 years. And the idea behind the 10 years is that we will give that 10 years for science and policy to catch up, to protect the ice while we still have it, and to develop longer term robust mechanisms for protecting this vital and delicate ecosystem.
Right. I think that's a very great idea and solid explanation. But what do you think it would take to have the moratorium in place?
I think the really key reason we need the moratorium in place is because we cannot allow the response to the loss of the ice to be how do we make money and how do we extract. It needs to instead be a recognition of the urgent crisis. And we've seen the global community rally behind this kind of thing before. I mean, the hole in the ozone layer is a great example. And the Montreal Protocol that was made in response to that. We've managed to rally the global community behind a moral issue of protecting something and stopping a crisis while we could, and it happened. And we absolutely can save the ice, but only if we get every single nation in the Arctic and outside of the Arctic, because it's non-Arctic states as well that are looking to expand industrial activity. And so we really need everyone to recognize that the long-term survival of the ice, and therefore the long-term survival of our species, is much more important than a short-term economic gain for a small amount of people and companies and countries.
I would just need to have the big picture in mind. And that being said, on policies, I'd also like to take the other side, which is law. How can the law be used to protect the Arctic? And this is not limited to the ecocide law, which I know we've spoken about in this season. How can general, genuine international law be used to protect the Arctic?
Yeah, I mean, international law has an absolutely crucial role in protecting the Arctic and also in combating the climate crisis as a whole. And I think we're really seeing a growth in that from the movement behind ecocide, the movement behind the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is a treaty that would essentially stop fossil fuels, and the moratorium as well. And I think it's this recognition of we have these systems of rules. And for a very long time, a lot of these rules have been facilitating fossil fuel exploitation, have been facilitating the systems that have created this crisis. But we can and we should change the rules. And the thing about the moratorium is it would be binding upon states. States would not be able to go into the Central Arctic Ocean and engage in these activities. And it would also be a recognition morally of the fact that that's not a desirable thing to do. And the power behind the law is both the legal obligation, but I think also the symbolic and moral recognition that comes with having something be agreed between states and on an international stage. And so I think ecocide, the moratorium, all of these different legal initiatives are really central to changing the rules, to changing the system, and also creating a new way of doing things.
I think it's really great because you touched on the moral side of things, and it's a big debate on how laws, in the end, or the end goal sometimes, is to integrate themselves into social norms. For example, we had a few years ago, or maybe a few hundred years ago, where children were treated as animals and they were overworked and all that. But when the laws were put in place on children's rights, these days you can't touch a child without everyone gasping, "What did you just do?" So going into the future, I think there's a lot of hope on how the law can easily be used to change criminal behavior and to change how society and social norms will operate. But anyway, this is a different topic. Going forward with all this work that Global Choices has been doing, and everyone who's trying their best to protect the Arctic and protect the biodiversity, I think I know of a group that's also stopping whaling, happening in Norway and Iceland and around the Arctic to some extent. So with all this action and calling for global participation going around, what is your hope for the Arctic and what is your hope for Earth?
My hope for the Arctic is a recognition of its role in our ecosystem, a recognition that everything is connected, and it is a protection of that ecosystem by refusing to engage in short-term economic gain at the expense of the long-term survival of our species and of the thousands of species that live in the Arctic, the unique biodiversity that is in there. And my other hope as well is that we reimagine how we do things. Because I think the fact that companies and corporations are responding to the possible loss of the Arctic as an economic opportunity rather than an existential crisis just represents so many issues with how we currently do things and how we have placed profit and economic gain at the center of everything. And so my hope is that we can reimagine how our society works, that we can reimagine how our systems work, and put people at the heart of things and also put community at the heart of things. One thing that Global Choices does, which has supported the moratorium's development, is the Arctic Angels Network, which is a network of young people around the world working to protect the Arctic, and it's building that sense of community. And I think community is absolutely crucial in these things because no one can overcome this alone. No one can solve the climate crisis by themselves. But if we come together and we use the collective power to change the rules and change the system and change the status quo, I think that is what will get us towards that idea of reimagining and building something new. And that is what I'm hopeful for.
Great. And the sense of community is something I have emphasized, I think, in the third or fourth episode of this season. So thank you for bringing it up again. I think during COP28, I have mentioned this so much. We were on a panel and one of our panelists suggested or stated that the Himalayas is like a third pole. Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, so the Himalayas has increasingly been called the kind of third pole because of the ecosystem's similarities in some ways with the ice, particularly at the top of the mountains, and also its crucial role in regulating global temperatures. And it's also a region that 1 billion people depend on. So it is absolutely crucial. And we are seeing a loss of the glaciers up the mountains. We're seeing a loss of the snow, a loss of the ice. And that will have really devastating consequences for water supply. For the 1 billion people who depend on that region, but also the global community, because, and this is the really key thing about the Arctic, is I think some people who live outside of the Arctic Circle, myself included, I live in Ireland, it's not an Arctic state. Beforehand, I was like, well, how does this affect me? But everything's connected. The Arctic, the Antarctic, the Himalayas of the third pole, everything is interconnected, and we really need to recognize that in our conversations.
Everything is interconnected. I think that's the beauty of nature. You can't have one without the other. So I think we can't protect the oceans or the trees without also thinking about the other sides of nature. And could you tell us some fun facts? Because I'm quite intrigued by ice and how it operates. Could you tell us some fun facts about ice and glaciers?
Some fun facts about ice and glaciers. I suppose ice is just generally, so sea ice basically is the ice in the ocean, whereas glaciers are on land. And then you've got icebergs, which is glaciers that like break off and fall into the ocean.
So is sea ice salty?
Sea ice salty? Do you know? I don't know. I imagine it would be because it's made from seawater. I've actually never thought about that, so I will find that out and get back to you.
I thought everything was fresh water. Anyway, thank you for that. Thank you for coming to this episode and the premiere of the next season and explaining to us the different sides of water, including ice. And thank you for giving us hope that we have been having things moving in those sides. We don't talk about ice so much, although they're very important. And thank you for showing us that there's a whole universe protecting the ice. So I'd pass it over to you for your last words.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I think the really key thing with this is, and what we really try and get across, is that we need everyone to protect the Arctic and to work towards climate justice as a whole. And so if, this has in any way inspired you or made you passionate about taking action for the Arctic, please go to globalchoices.org and sign up to become an Arctic Ice Force Defender, or if you're eligible, apply to be an Arctic Angel, or even talk about the Arctic in your own campaigning, in your own lives. And I think we just really need everyone on board to recognise the importance of preserving the ice while we still have it, because once it's gone for good.
And that's the scary part to some extent. Once it's gone, it's gone. So we need as many people to protect it while we still have it for our future and the biodiversity that depends on it. So thanks again for coming, and we hope to speak soon.
No worries. Thank you so much for having me.
See you on the next season, which will talk about much to do with water. So hold on tight. Ta-da! That's the end.